Forget the picture book version of medieval life. The festivals, the jousts, the music echoing across castle walls. In reality, some of the most crowded events in a medieval town weren't tournaments or holy processions. They were marriage fairs. And these fairs had very little to do with love and everything to do with commerce. Imagine walking through a bustling square in 15th century England or northern France. On one side, the smell of roasted meat; on the other, the braying of livestock. And then, just beyond the pigs and cattle, rows of young women, some barely teenagers, lined up, not as spectators, but as merchandise. Their parents stood nearby, whispering prices, dowries, and family connections like horse traders sizing up a deal. It was common knowledge that in places like Wakefield in Yorkshire or certain regions of Brittany, specific days of the year were unofficially known as bride fairs. Families brought their daughters like farmers brought animals, hoping to secure the highest bid. A strong set of hips, worth more. A reputation for fertility in the family line, worth more still. A wealthy dowry attached. Then the girl became the medieval equivalent of a luxury item. Marriage, in theory, was sacred. The church declared it a holy union, a covenant blessed by God. But on the ground it functioned less like a religious ceremony and more like a cattle auction. Girls were paraded in public, their names and qualities shouted to the crowd. In some cases, notices were nailed to church doors announcing a daughter's availability, complete with lineage and dowry details like primitive dating profiles carved in ink and parchment. And the deals weren't sealed with romance. They were signed over ale. Tavern owners made fortunes, hosting contract negotiations where fathers and future husbands haggled over the value of a girl's body and womb while drinking themselves into a stupor. Some contracts survive to this day, cold, legal documents, treating a daughter not as a person but as property transferred between men. This was not fringe behavior. It was woven into the very fabric of society. Noble families treated their daughters as bargaining chips to secure alliances, and peasants followed suit in smaller, local markets. What united them was the same brutal logic. A woman was a vessel for heirs, a unit of labor, and a potential liability if she remained unmarried too long. For the daughters, there was no escape. Refusal was almost unthinkable. A girl who resisted risked shaming her family, forfeiting her dowry, or being cast out entirely. Many endured the humiliation silently, standing in crowded squares while strange men appraised them like butchers poking a side of beef. It's tempting to dismiss all this as distant, barbaric custom, but pause for a moment. How different is this really from the language of modern commerce? Dating apps where women are swiped left or right, their photos judged in seconds. Reality shows where marriages are staged for ratings. Even today, entire industries revolve around women being marketed for desirability. The medieval marketplace may look cruder, but the logic that women's worth is transactional echoes disturbingly close. And for those unlucky enough to be sold at these fairs, the ordeal didn't end with the contract, because signing a daughter's future away was only the beginning. Her new husband, his family, and the community at large demanded proof that the bargain was good. That meant humiliation, inspection, and trials of a kind that make a cattle auction look merciful. If being sold in the open square was degrading, what happened next was far worse. Because once a girl was purchased, she still had to be tested. And that is where the true horror begins. They called it a union of souls, blessed by God and sanctified before the altar. But before a girl ever walked into a church to say her vows, she was walked through something else, an inspection, and not the kind you imagine for a sacred bond. No, this was closer to the way you'd check the teeth of a horse before buying it. In marketplaces, across England, France, and the German states, once a marriage deal seemed promising, the buyer's family didn't just shake hands and trust. They wanted proof. Proof that the girl was healthy, proof that she was fertile, proof that she could endure the dangerous role of being a man's property for breeding. And so she was prodded, examined, and humiliated in ways that stripped away any shred of dignity. Historical accounts tell us of fathers standing silent while prospective husbands pried open their daughters' mouths to check teeth, running fingers along gums like traders deciding whether an animal could chew properly. Strong teeth meant fewer medical expenses down the line. Wide hips meant safer childbirth. Firm breasts were signs of youthful fertility. Each part of her body became a data point in a grotesque ledger of value. In some cases, men demanded to see the girl's hair unbound to check for lice or bald patches. Others lifted skirts right there in public squares, squeezing calves and thighs like a butcher testing meat. There are written testimonies of grooms' families demanding to feel a girl's hips and waistline, judging whether she looked capable of bearing sons. In wealthier circles, it could be more formalized. Matrons or midwives brought in to examine the girl while the men discussed dowries. But in villages and towns, it was often cruder, faster, and undeniably public. Imagine the shame. A young woman forced to stand still, strangers circling her like wolves, hands tugging at her dress. Some whispered crude comments. Others barked questions about her mother's fertility record. And through it all, she was expected to smile, to appear compliant, to avoid the sin of disobedience, because even a hint of resistance could brand her as difficult, lowering her market value. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of medieval superstition, but peel back the humor and it's sickening. What modern society disguises as swiping left or right on a dating app, the cold reduction of human beings into commodities, was acted out with brutal physicality in these fairs. Tinder, but with hands and eyes roaming your body in a crowded square. A humiliating mix of sexual objectification and agricultural trade. And just like livestock, these inspections often had witnesses. Communities gossiped about the quality of girls, spreading stories about defects, diseases, or supposed infertility. A girl rejected publicly wasn't just humiliated once. She might never recover her reputation, her value plummeted, her chances of marriage with it. In a society where survival depended on being chosen, rejection was a sentence of social death. All of this was justified under the guise of responsibility. Families claimed they were protecting their sons from bad investments. The church claimed marriage had to be entered into wisely, but peel away the holy language, and what remained was a grotesque ritual of dehumanization. Young women were reduced to flesh and blood transactions, stripped of privacy, dignity, and choice. And here's the most disturbing part. The inspection wasn't the end. Because for some girls, humiliation in the market square wasn't enough proof. Families and church courts demanded more than outward signs. They wanted evidence that a bride was pure. They wanted physical confirmation that she was untouched. And to prove that, they devised something far more invasive than a simple inspection. If you think being treated like livestock was degrading, wait until you hear what happened when a girl was ordered to prove her virginity, because that was a trial no one could escape. They said purity was the foundation of marriage. But in the Middle Ages, purity wasn't just preached, it was policed. And the way it was enforced makes even the darkest modern scandals look tame. Because when a girl's entire worth hinged on being untouched, suspicion alone could drag her into a nightmare. Imagine this: a bride-to-be, barely 15, standing in front of a church court. Her groom's family whispers that she might not be pure. Maybe a rival spread a rumor. Maybe her body simply didn't look the part. That was enough to trigger an official investigation, and investigations meant proof. Proof delivered not by faith, not by trust, but by physical examination. Records survive of judges ordering midwives to inspect a girl before a wedding could proceed. Strangers forced to touch, prod, and report on what was supposed to be the most private part of her body. And the stakes were staggering. A single declaration, defilement, could ruin her, stripping away her chance of marriage, dowry, even survival. In some cases, it wasn't even done behind closed doors. Accounts from France and parts of Italy describe entire communities gathering to witness what they called tests of honor. A bride dragged into a chamber while midwives or matrons checked her body, then announced the results aloud to waiting crowds. Imagine the shame your future dictated not by your character, not by your family, but by the public verdict on your anatomy. And let's not pretend these tests had medical authority. Medieval understanding of the body was crude at best, superstitious at worst. The infamous Hymen test was unreliable then, as it is now. A girl could be condemned for riding a horse, for climbing too vigorously, for nothing at all. Virginity wasn't a biological fact. It was a social weapon, one that men wielded with terrifying effectiveness. Some men went even further, demanding proof after the marriage had already taken place. Bedsheets displayed after the wedding night, stained with blood, paraded before relatives as evidence of purity. If the sheets showed nothing, accusations flew, families clashed, and once again, the girl bore the blame. It didn't matter that the science was false, that many women simply didn't bleed. The logic was stacked against her from the beginning. Think of it like a medieval reality show. Except the prize wasn't money, it was survival. Fail the test, and you lost everything. Your husband might abandon you, your family might disown you, the community might brand you a whore. In a world where women had no independent legal or economic power, that was the equivalent of a death sentence. And sometimes it became quite literal. We know of cases where brides accused of failing were locked away in convents, their lives effectively over. Others were beaten, driven from their homes, or even executed under charges of dishonor, all because of rumors, superstition, or a body that didn't conform to an impossible demand. And here's the cruelest irony of all. The church, which claimed to defend women's sanctity, became complicit in their degradation. Priests and judges presided over these trials. Clerics used sermons to terrify girls into compliance. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was a currency, one traded, inspected, and publicly audited. But even if a girl survived the ordeal, even if she passed the test, her nightmare was only beginning. Because the moment her virginity was confirmed, her body wasn't her own. It became an investment, her womb expected to produce sons, her survival tied to her ability to breed. And for those who failed, the punishment was worse than humiliation. Because in the medieval world, failing the virginity test could mean death. Love stories may dominate medieval ballads, but in real life, love was rarely the reason a marriage took place. Behind the poetry and sermons, marriage was cold mathematics. A wife was not a partner in romance. She was an asset, her value measured in land, alliances, and above all, her ability to produce children. Not just any children. Sons. The womb was the medieval stock exchange. A girl's worth was calculated on her capacity to breed heirs, ensuring the continuity of bloodlines, inheritances, and political power. A barren wife was more than a disappointment. She was a financial disaster. Families invested heavily in dowries, land transfers, and social negotiations. If that investment didn't yield the expected return, healthy male heirs, the woman became a liability, and liabilities were disposed of. Records show noblemen petitioning the church to annul marriages on the grounds of infertility. Annulment was essentially medieval divorce, but it came with brutal consequences. A woman cast aside for a barren womb was branded defective, her reputation destroyed. Some were sent to convents, where they lived out their days in forced religious seclusion. Others returned in disgrace to their families, who now had to carry the shame of a failed bargain. And infertility was always presumed to be the woman's fault. Never mind the husband's health. Never mind venereal disease, malnutrition, or sheer genetic bad luck. If no heir came, the blame landed squarely on the wife. She became the scapegoat for an entire lineage's failure, beaten, humiliated, or quietly replaced. Even success carried its own cruelty. A wife who bore daughters, but not sons, faced the same stigma. Too many girls meant inheritance disputes, weakened alliances, and no male heir to carry the family name. Some women lived in fear with every birth, hoping desperately for a boy to secure their position, knowing that too many daughters could spell disaster. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. Even she faced accusations of barrenness when she failed to produce a male heir early in her marriage to Louis VII of France. Her queenship wasn't protection, it was leverage. If the queen could be cast aside as useless, what chance did ordinary women have? The church reinforced the system. Priests preached that wives were bound by duty to produce children, and that failure to do so was grounds for annulment. Men, meanwhile, could parade mistresses openly, father illegitimate sons, and still blame their wives for being barren. Hypocrisy wrapped in sanctity, leaving women trapped in a rigged game they could never truly win. The cruelty of this mindset hasn't entirely vanished. Today, fertility treatments like IVF are hailed as miracles, but they also reveal society's ongoing obsession with reproductive success. Women still face pressure to conceive, still hear whispers of failure when pregnancies don't happen. The medieval logic that a woman's worth lies in her womb still lingers, dressed up in modern science instead of medieval theology. And for those who failed in the Middle Ages, the punishment was swift. Annulment, beatings, exile to convents. Some were even accused of witchcraft, as if their empty wombs were the work of demons. But here's the darker truth. Even when women succeeded, even when they fulfilled the role forced upon them, even when they bore sons, their nightmare was far from over. Because childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't just dangerous, it was often fatal. And that's where this twisted logic turns even more grotesque. Because in a world that treated women as breeding stock, pregnancy itself became a death sentence. For a medieval wife, success was survival. For a little while, if she proved fertile, if she conceived, if she carried her husband's heir, she bought herself security. But security came at a cost, because pregnancy was not the triumph it appeared to be. It was a gamble, one that often ended in blood. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 10 mothers died giving birth. Some never made it past their first child. Others endured a cycle of pregnancies that slowly broke their bodies until the inevitable happened. And the men, they didn't stop to grieve. A wife was replaceable. Her womb had done its work, and if it failed, another could be purchased to take her place. Accounts from noble households are especially chilling. One chronicler describes a lord who married 4 times each, wife dying in childbirth, each quickly replaced by another young bride. To him, they weren't wives, they were vessels, disposable containers for his lineage. Their deaths were simply the cost of doing business. The horror wasn't limited to noble families. In peasant cottages, childbirth was no less deadly. Without doctors, without sanitation, women relied on midwives who did what they could with herbs, prayers, and superstition. Infection raged through torn bodies. Hemorrhage drained lives away in hours. Babies often died alongside their mothers, leaving fathers scrambling to find a replacement wife to nurse the survivors or to make new ones. And yet, despite the staggering risk, women were forced into pregnancy again and again. Contraception was condemned as sinful. Abstinence was rarely an option. A woman's only recognized purpose was to produce children, and failing to do so invited punishment. Refusing to risk her life was not considered bravery. It was considered defiance. Even queens weren't spared. Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of Henry VIII, died just days after delivering the much-longed-for son Edward. She was praised as a martyr to motherhood, her death framed as noble sacrifice. But beneath the courtly eulogies was the brutal truth. She was celebrated for dying in service to her husband's ambition. Her body was consumed by childbirth, and history honored her for it. The cruelty was compounded by ritual. Women were expected to give birth in public view, with neighbors or attendants crowding into their chambers. Privacy didn't exist. Their screams echoed through stone walls as proof of their labor, and if the child was male, the pain was considered worthwhile. If it was female, the ordeal was sometimes met with disappointment, even disgust. Imagine risking your life only to be told you had failed by producing the wrong sex. And when death came, it was often seen as the woman's fault, evidence of weakness, or punishment for sin. The church taught that Eve's curse was to suffer in childbirth, and so every woman's agony was framed as divine justice. Dying in labor wasn't tragedy, it was theology. This is what made the breeders' market so grotesque. Even when women succeeded, even when they gave their husbands what they demanded, the very act of success could kill them. Survival was temporary. The womb that secured their place in the household was the same womb that destroyed them. And for the daughters left behind, the cycle started all over again. They would be raised, paraded, and eventually sold in the same markets that had condemned their mothers. But the story grows even darker, because not all girls had to wait until adulthood to face the trade. Some were sold off long before they even reached womanhood. And that's where the true horror of the daughter market begins. If death in childbirth didn't claim a woman, her daughters carried the weight of her survival, and they weren't spared. In fact, they were often trapped in the system before they even became women, because in medieval Europe, the breeders' market wasn't just about wives, it was about daughters. Sometimes children sold off like livestock long before they could even understand what marriage meant. Marriage age varied by region, but the church technically allowed girls to be betrothed at 12. In practice, betrothals often happened much earlier. Families arranged contracts for children as young as 7 or 8, promising them to men twice, even 3 times their age. Some of these unions were symbolic until the girl reached puberty, but others weren't. There are records of 9-year-old brides sent to live with husbands in their 40s, expected to share their beds and begin producing heirs before their bodies were even capable of surviving the attempt. It wasn't scandal, it was strategy. For noble families, marrying off daughters young secured alliances before rivals could interfere. A girl's body became the bargaining chip in a geopolitical chess game, her childhood sacrificed to cement power. For peasants it was economic desperation. A daughter was one more mouth to feed, and selling her early meant fewer years of financial strain. In both cases, her will didn't matter. She was an asset to be liquidated. The horror didn't stop with age. Once a daughter was sold, she entered a household as a stranger, often surrounded by in-laws who saw her as a burden until she proved herself. Abuse was common. Older husbands treated child brides as pliable property, and because she was so young, she had no authority, no leverage, no escape. Her life could be decades of forced labor, forced sex, and forced childbirth, if she even survived long enough. The hypocrisy was staggering. Medieval sermons waxed poetic about innocence, purity, and childhood as sacred gifts from God. And yet, those same societies sanctioned the selling of children as breeding stock. Imagine today a society that praised the innocence of children while simultaneously signing them over to strangers for lifelong contracts of sex and labor. We'd call it trafficking. They called it marriage. Some of the most powerful figures in history were caught in this system. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was married off at 12 and pregnant by 13. She nearly died delivering her son, her body permanently damaged by a birth that should never have happened. Yet she was considered lucky because her son survived, lucky because she produced an heir. That word lucky hides the horror. A child nearly killed to ensure the continuation of a dynasty. And it wasn't only nobles. Parish records tell us of peasants pawning their daughters to older men for little more than a few coins or animals. Imagine being 12, led by your father into a tavern, signed over to a man old enough to be your grandfather, while neighbors toasted the deal with ale. It sounds monstrous, but it was ordinary, it was legal, it was expected. And here's the most chilling part. For many girls, this wasn't just the beginning of a cycle, it was the end of their childhood. The laughter of play, the safety of family, the innocence of youth, all erased in an instant, replaced by duties their bodies weren't ready to bear. But if the cruelty of child marriage seems like the worst of it, think again, because even when women survived the marketplace, even when they endured the inspections, the virginity tests, the childbirths, the contracts and alliances, they could still be discarded like broken tools once they were deemed used up. And what medieval men did to their so-called disposable wives reveals the darkest hypocrisy of all. In a world where women were treated as investments, their value was never permanent. A wife who no longer served her purpose, whether through infertility, illness, disobedience, or simply age, was as expendable as worn-out livestock. And medieval society had no shortage of ways to discard them. Some were cast aside quietly, through annulments granted by pliant church courts. Husbands petitioned priests to dissolve marriages on the grounds of barrenness or incompatibility, which often meant nothing more than boredom. The hypocrisy was suffocating. The church preached marriage as indissoluble, sacred, eternal, yet loopholes opened readily for men with money, power, or influence. For the wife, annulment wasn't freedom, it was exile. She left with no dowry, no children, no protection. Her identity as wife stripped away, her social standing collapsed. Others weren't abandoned, but erased. Domestic records contain chilling entries of wives beaten to death, or poisoned, or left to waste away in locked rooms. In peasant villages, where legal oversight was minimal, such crimes could be brushed aside as misfortune. In noble courts, they were justified with rhetoric. A queen who fell from favor could be accused of adultery or witchcraft, her downfall staged as justice rather than convenience. The most infamous case is, of course, Henry VIII, who made an art of discarding women. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 2 cast aside, 1 dying after childbirth, 1 outliving him through sheer luck. He is remembered as a tyrant, but his behavior was not as unique as we like to imagine. His power amplified his cruelty, but the logic that a wife's value ended when she ceased producing heirs was universal. Henry was simply louder about it. And it wasn't only kings who practiced this brutal economy of disposal. In village courts across Europe, petitions survive of men demanding dowries back after unsatisfactory marriages. Some killed wives outright, calculating that the punishment, if there was any, would be less costly than keeping them. In an age when women had no legal voice, a man's word was often enough to excuse or explain away his violence. The absurdity is that society cloaked all this in sanctity. A man could abandon his wife while still attending Mass, his violence framed as discipline, his abandonment justified as necessity. Priests blessed new unions while discarded wives starved in convents or begged on the streets. Marriage, supposedly holy, became a revolving door for men and a death trap for women. The cruelest irony, loyalty was expected from women until their last breath. A wife who failed to please her husband was disposable, but a wife who dared to leave her husband unthinkable. The system permitted only one kind of exit, and it was always on the husband's terms. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a statement. Women were property, and property could be replaced. The breeder's market didn't end when a bride was bought. It extended across her life, calculating her value at every stage: virginity, fertility, obedience, survival, and once the ledger reached 0, the woman herself ceased to matter. Yet even here, the hypocrisy reached higher still. Because the very institution that preached eternal sacred union, the church, was the same institution profiting from annulments, blessing replacements, and legitimizing the cycle of disposal. And that's where the story descends into its final, most grotesque revelation. Because the marketplace of women wasn't just tolerated by the church, it was fueled by it. If there was one institution that claimed to defend the sanctity of marriage, it was the medieval church. Priests thundered from pulpits about holy unions, bishops declared marriage a sacrament, and popes wrapped the entire institution in the language of divine order. But behind the sermons and rituals was a far uglier truth. The church didn't just tolerate the breeder's market, it profited from it. Every step of the process, from betrothal to burial, came with a fee. Families paid to have banns announced, to secure dispensations, to negotiate annulments. The church collected coins at every transaction like a broker in a stock exchange of human lives. What they called sacred duties often looked more like sales taxes. Take annulments. Officially, marriage was indissoluble. What God joined, no man could put asunder. Yet men with influence had no trouble convincing church courts to void their unions. All it took was the right argument, and more importantly, the right payment. A claim of consanguinity, being too closely related, could unravel a marriage decades after the wedding. Barren wives could be discarded with clerical approval, and the paperwork lined the coffers of bishops who blessed the trade. Even child marriage, the selling of daughters at 12, found its defenders in theology. Priests cited biblical precedent. Virgin Mary was betrothed as a teenager. They argued, so who were we to condemn? With divine authority, they blessed the contracts that robbed girls of their childhoods. Behind closed doors, clerics justified what they publicly condemned, weaponizing scripture to turn exploitation into sacrament. And the hypocrisy reached its grotesque peak in the markets themselves. Girls were paraded in public squares just steps from church doors, their fates negotiated within earshot of the bells tolling for mass. Priests performed blessings for marriages that had been arranged like cattle sales, their prayers sanctifying contracts written in taverns and sealed with ale. The juxtaposition is almost cinematic. The incense and chanting inside, the auctioneer's bark and bargaining outside. The church even encouraged the obsession with virginity, enforcing humiliating tests that reduced women to objects of inspection. They preached chastity while enabling the public violation of women's dignity. They called marriage sacred, then turned it into a commodity. It was religion as theater, morality as business, holiness as hypocrisy. And of course, the ultimate beneficiaries were men. Wealthy husbands gained the church's blessing to discard wives, replace them, and secure fresh property. Fathers gained legitimacy in selling their daughters. The church didn't just stand by, it gave the entire system its moral cover, the stamp of divine approval that made the unspeakable seem not just legal, but holy. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes unbearable. The same clerics who policed women's sexuality were themselves notorious for breaking vows of celibacy, keeping concubines, and fathering illegitimate children. They thundered about purity from the pulpit, then indulged in the very sins they condemned. And yet they had the power to ruin a woman's life for failing to live up to standards they themselves ignored. It was a closed system of exploitation, women's bodies as currency, men as traders, and the church as the bank. And like any bank, it grew rich on fees, penalties, and the ruin of others. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to show. Outrage simmered, whispers of reform spread, and voices began to question whether marriage, as defined by the church, was holy at all. But for centuries, the system endured, crushing countless lives under the weight of its hypocrisy. And so the breeder's market wasn't just a quirk of medieval culture, it was the foundation of Western marriage itself, shaped, sanctioned, and sanctified by the very institution that claimed to protect it. But what does that mean for us now? Because if the medieval world turned marriage into a market, and the church made it holy business, then we're forced to ask a chilling question. We began with markets, with young women paraded like animals before crowds. We watched them inspected like livestock, their bodies prodded, their worth measured in bones and hips. We saw them humiliated in virginity trials, condemned by superstition masquerading as faith. We followed them into marriages where their wombs became investments, where childbirth wasn't a blessing, but a calculated risk, a gamble that killed 1 in 10. We watched daughters sold before puberty, forced into lives they could not comprehend. And when wives grew old or failed or simply outlived their usefulness, we saw them discarded, beaten, exiled, erased. And standing over all of it was the church, the so-called guardian of morality, profiting at every turn. They sanctified the market, blessed the contracts, enforced the humiliations, and then preached that all of it was sacred. The breeders' market wasn't an aberration. It was the system. What does that reveal? That for centuries, women's bodies were treated as property, their lives governed by economics, politics, and theology, masquerading as love. That marriage as we celebrate it today, flowers, vows, romance, was built on foundations of control and commerce. Privacy is a modern invention. Choice is a modern invention. The idea that a woman owns her own body is, historically speaking, shockingly new. And yet, listen closely, the echoes remain. Modern fertility industries still speak of wombs as services, IVF as investment. Young girls in some parts of the world are still married off before they can read. Women are still pressured, still judged, still measured against impossible standards of purity and reproduction. The costumes have changed, the rituals have changed, but the logic, the cold arithmetic of control has not fully disappeared. That is the final horror of the breeders' market. It isn't just medieval history. It's a mirror, one that forces us to ask how much of our modern world is still built on the same foundation of commodification, how much of our culture still whispers the same brutal message, that a woman's value lies in her body, her fertility, her compliance. The Middle Ages may be gone, but the marketplace they created still haunts us. And until we confront it, the echoes of the breeders' market will never truly die.